The Time Merchant's gallery wasn't your typical art gallery. You wouldn't find portraits of stoic aristocrats or landscapes captured in serene golden light. No, this gallery was different. Here, the walls were lined with parchment scrolls that contained stories, stories of time itself. Not just the stories of ordinary people, but tales of moments frozen in time, memories caught and immortalized for those who could afford them. People came to the gallery for many reasons. Some wanted to preserve the good parts of their lives, weddings, births, triumphs. Others, like the young, heartbroken woman who'd once purchased a scroll to capture the exact moment she had caught her boyfriend cheating, had more complex motives. The Time Merchant didn't judge. He simply provided the service. The merchant, a man of middle age with sharp eyes that seemed to have seen 1,000 lifetimes, had made his living in the preservation of time. He didn't just collect these stories, he was the keeper of them. His gallery was a sanctuary for time itself, holding the secrets of every life it touched. His job was simple: exchange the stories of others for payment. Sometimes that payment was a question. Sometimes it was a favor. But there was one rule, one immutable law: the stories stayed in the gallery. This day, however, was not like any other. It began just like any day. The merchant, who hadn't yet gotten around to actually opening his gallery to the public, was polishing the glass cases around his favorite scrolls. It was just another Tuesday, until the door creaked open. "Can I help you?" he asked without looking up, assuming it was another customer in search of a memory to buy. "You can, actually," came a deep, gravelly voice from the doorway. The Time Merchant looked up, startled. Standing there, framed in the doorway, was a man. But not just any man. This man looked old. Ancient, in fact. His hair was silvered, his skin wrinkled with the wisdom of the centuries. But something about his eyes, something about the way he carried himself, struck the Time Merchant. He recognized those eyes. "You?" the merchant whispered, half to himself. The man smiled cryptically. "Yes, it's me. Calyx, your brother." For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. The merchant's world had just turned upside down. Calyx had been gone for centuries. The Time Merchant had all but forgotten about his brother. After all, how could one forget the man who had disappeared from his life so suddenly? They had been inseparable once, sharing in the strange experiments and endeavors that their shared past had entailed, until Calyx had vanished, choosing to live outside the constraints of time, a decision the merchant could never understand. The gallery had been a refuge for the merchant, a place to capture the moments of others and preserve time in a way that could never be undone. But Calyx's sudden reappearance shattered the stillness of that world. The gallery, which had been a fortress of memories, now felt more like a cage, a reflection of every regret the Time Merchant had ever harbored. How did you find me?" the merchant stammered, unable to mask the shock in his voice. Calyx took a step forward, his hands clasped behind his back, and chuckled softly. "You don't think I'd leave you alone forever, do you? After all, you and I, well, we have unfinished business." The merchant's heart skipped a beat. "Unfinished business?" Calyx smiled faintly. "You see, I've been watching. Watching you preserve time, watching you try to control it. But I've come to realize something: time isn't something we control. It controls us. And you've been hiding something, haven't you?" The Time Merchant felt a chill run down his spine. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie," Calyx said, his voice low and full of meaning. "I know all about the gallery. I know what you've been keeping in it." The merchant's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Calyx's gaze was unwavering. "I've seen the scrolls you've hidden. The ones that tell the truth. The truth about us." For a brief moment, the merchant felt his breath catch in his throat. There was no way Calyx could know about those scrolls. He had hidden them so carefully, tucked away in the most secret corners of the gallery. The stories they held weren't just any stories, they were their stories. The scrolls that detailed their shared past. A past that the merchant had long tried to forget. The merchant began, but Calyx held up a hand, silencing him. You don't need to explain. I already know. And you know, deep down, that you can't hide it anymore. It's time for the truth. The merchant didn't respond. He couldn't. He could feel the weight of years pressing down on him. The things he had done, the choices he had made, it all came flooding back in that instant. Let me show you something, Calyx said, stepping forward toward the wall where the scrolls were kept. He reached for one of the oldest, most worn scrolls, the one that the merchant had been avoiding for decades. That one, the merchant said quickly, you don't want to, but it was too late. Calyx had already unrolled it, revealing the story contained within. The scroll was a tale unlike any the merchant had ever shared with anyone else. It wasn't a story about some far-off customer's life. It was their life, his and Calyx's. The story on that scroll told of a time long before the gallery had ever come into existence, when the two brothers had worked together to master the very essence of time. Back then, they had been part of an ancient order, sworn to protect and control time's flow. But something had happened, something that tore them apart. Calyx had chosen to live beyond the rules of time. He had abandoned the order and vanished, leaving the merchant to carry the burden alone. The scroll detailed their falling out, their fierce arguments, the promises broken, the betrayal. But it also told of the bond they once shared, a bond forged in the pursuit of understanding time in all its forms. A bond that, over the years, the merchant had tried to bury, convincing himself that he had outgrown it, but the truth was undeniable. Calyx had never truly left. He had always been watching, waiting for the moment when the merchant's secrets would be uncovered. I never wanted this to come to light, the merchant admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I thought if I could just control time, just preserve it, I could undo the mistakes we made. Calyx laughed softly. You've been trying to outsmart time, my dear brother. But time isn't something you control. It's something you learn to live with. The merchant was silent, the weight of those words sinking in. He had been trying to escape time, but it was time that had shaped him, shaped them both. You've lived so long in the past, Calyx continued. But it's time to face the future. Our future. The merchant looked at him, unsure of what to say. The idea of confronting the future, of letting go of the past, was terrifying. He had spent so many years perfecting his craft, preserving moments that could never be undone. But now, standing here with Calyx, he realized that perhaps it was time to let go. Time, after all, was not meant to be controlled. It was meant to be experienced, for better or worse. Calyx smiled knowingly. Are you ready to face the truth? The gallery, so meticulously curated and brimming with stories that captured the essence of moments, now felt like a cage, a place holding more than just memories. It held the weight of everything the time merchant had ever tried to bury. The hidden scrolls, the fragmented pieces of their shared past, he could no longer escape them. Calyx's voice broke the silence once again. You still don't get it, do you? Time doesn't stop for anyone. Not for me, not for you. You've spent your life trying to control it, trying to put it in boxes and frame it like a painting, but you're just a prisoner of it. You're trying to trap something that can never be trapped. The merchant swallowed hard, unable to fully digest what his brother was saying. He had spent so many years curating time, preserving it, freezing it in its most beautiful moments. The idea that time could not be controlled, could not be stored like an artifact, was unthinkable. Yet, here was Calyx, a living reminder of everything the merchant had tried to deny. You're right, the merchant finally said, his voice low, resigned. I spent so long trying to preserve time, to keep it from slipping away. But it doesn't work. I've been running from it, and from you. Calyx stepped closer to him, the faintest trace of a smile crossing his lips. It's never too late to stop running. Time, for all its power, is also a mirror. It shows us who we truly are, what we're willing to face. And now, you're here. The real question is, what are you going to do about it? The merchant let the question linger in the air, his mind racing. He'd spent so much of his life creating this gallery, building this illusion that time could be captured, controlled. But the truth was, the gallery wasn't a sanctuary. It wasn't a fortress. It was just another prison. A way for him to hide from what he feared most, the very passage of time itself. I can't change the past, the merchant said quietly. But maybe I can do something different now. Calyx nodded, almost as though he had been waiting for him to come to this realization. Exactly. You've spent your life trying to control things that can't be controlled. But what if, instead, you embraced the flow? What if you stopped trying to trap time and let it carry you where it will? The merchant felt a strange stir of hope, something he hadn't felt in years. The notion of relinquishing control, of stepping away from the constant drive to preserve every moment, it was terrifying, but also liberating. Maybe that's what he had always needed. To stop being the keeper of time and simply live with it. I spent so much time holding on to the past, hoping that if I could preserve it, I could fix the mistakes I made, the merchant said, his voice thick with emotion. But I see now that the past is already gone. It's over. I have to move forward, don't I? Calyx's eyes softened. Yes. You do. And so do I. For a long moment, the two stood there in the quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of the scrolls as if they, too, were acknowledging the change in the air. Time had always been their shared burden, but now, it seemed, it could also be their salvation. The merchant's gaze drifted to the scrolls lining the walls of the gallery, the countless stories that filled the space. They were all pieces of a greater puzzle, fragments of lives that had passed through the gallery, some fleeting, some eternal. And yet, as he looked at them now, they no longer felt like mere objects to be preserved. They felt like echoes of the past, reminders of everything he had tried to hold on to. Without saying a word, the merchant stepped over to the nearest scroll and began to carefully unroll it. It was a story from his own life, a story he had once locked away in the deepest corner of his mind. A moment he had never wanted to remember. But now, as he read the words, he didn't feel the familiar pang of regret. Instead, he felt a sense of understanding, a sense of acceptance. This was a part of him, a part of his journey. And it had led him here, this one, he said softly, turning to Calyx. This is the one I've always avoided. The one I couldn't bear to face. Calyx walked over and looked at the scroll. His expression softened. We all have those moments. The ones we wish we could forget. But we don't have to forget them. We can accept them. The merchant nodded slowly, as though a weight had lifted off his shoulders. The truth had always been there, waiting for him to embrace it. Time couldn't be controlled, nor could it be erased. But it could be lived. I was wrong, the merchant said, his voice steady now. I've spent so many years running from the truth, trying to trap time in these scrolls. But I see now that I can't control it. I have to live with it, let it carry me forward. Calyx smiled, his expression a mixture of pride and relief. Good. You've taken the first step. The merchant looked around the gallery once more. It no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a place of possibilities. The scrolls, each one a snapshot of time, were still there, but they no longer held him captive. They were simply part of the flow, like the river of time that had brought him here. You've done it, haven't you? The merchant asked. You found a way to live outside of time, to exist without being bound by it. Calyx laughed, the sound rich and warm. Not exactly. But I've learned to stop fighting it. I've learned to embrace it. And that's what you need to do now, too. The merchant nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't about controlling time. It was about accepting it, living within its flow. And now, he could finally begin to do that. Maybe it's time to close the gallery, the merchant said, his voice thoughtful. Calyx raised an eyebrow. Close it? The merchant smiled, his eyes twinkling. Not in the way you think. I think it's time to stop collecting stories, to stop trying to preserve everything. I'm going to live. I'm going to experience time, rather than try to control it. Calyx laughed softly, a deep chuckle that echoed through the gallery. I think that sounds like a good plan. For the first time in years, the time merchant felt free. The gallery, once his sanctuary, his fortress, was no longer a place to hide. It was a place to start over, to let go of the past and live in the present. Time, for all its power, had never been the enemy. It was the greatest gift, and so, the merchant took the first step into a new life, no longer a prisoner of time but a participant in it. As he walked out of the gallery, leaving the scrolls behind, he felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. Time, after all, had always been his greatest teacher. Now, it was his turn to learn.